am of Aboriginal descent and I have hunted all my life. A friend and I decided to search for a new area to track moose and deer. And we both live in Prince George and we know all the areas within 50 miles or so, but we had the itch to go see some new country. We hooked the Jeep to the back of the motorhome and off we went toward the mountains and Pine Pass. We found a perfect spot just off Highway 97, 18 miles south of Chetwynd. It was noon when we disconnected the Jeep and immediately drove up the older trail to see where it would take us. To our surprise, the road was in pretty decent shape as we immediately started to climb up the mountain. We came to several awesome clear cuts that allowed us to see in all directions. We were in the middle of one of these clear cuts and decided to hide the Jeep back in the heavily forested area and walk to a good vantage point that was in the middle of the clearing. We were sitting on a knoll that was about 12 feet above the skidder trail, which we could see through the willows. We figured that we would enjoy a couple of sandwiches and didn't really expect to come across anything unusual as we had driven through with the Jeep 20 minutes earlier. It was a beautiful day, and we were sitting with our backs to each other, me watching the downhill and my partner watching the uphill. The grade was 10 to 12% and with small willows not blocking our vantage point, and we could see 500 yards in all directions. 4 massive bucks came out of a patch of trees that were only 150 yards on the downhill side. Well, that was a good sign, and since it was the day before the season opened, we headed back to set up camp and we decided that we would walk to the same spot in the morning. We set out before daylight because we figured it would take us an hour to get there on foot. I have to admit that this was a bit unnerving for me because I like to see my surroundings when I'm in grizzly country. But nevertheless, off we went. My partner had done this night walk hundreds of times and he said that we would be fine. He was such a nice guy that if we happened to come across a grizzly in the dark, he was going to trip me and get the hell out of there. He didn't get the chuckle out of me that he was expecting. Anyway, we arrived about 20 minutes before shooting light, and we just sat there and listened to all of nature's sounds. Now, this next part is very important, and it needs to be explained. There was no way in hell that even a coyote could be in the vicinity without one of us spotting it. There was nowhere for an animal to hide unless they were crouched within the same small clump of trees that the bucks had emerged from the day before. It was an uneventful first few hours, and it was now approaching the same time of day that we had initially seen those deer. There wasn't much wind except for a slight breeze from time to time. I had just remarked to my buddy about how quiet it was, when all at once I could hear a high-pitched buzzing sound, and I thought it might just be my ears ringing. The best way to describe the sound was as if someone had put a tuning fork to my head. I looked over to my buddy and he said he could hear it too. On the skidder trail, right below us, appeared a dark shape that we could see through the willows. There was literally no way that this thing could have walked up on us because we could see 90% of the terrain all around us. It had hair rather than fur. And then all at once it stood up on 2 legs and it was staring right at us. Now, that freaked me out, and my buddy with the cooler head warned me not to shoot but to take the safety off and be ready. This thing stared at us for what seemed like an eternity but was probably only seconds. It dropped back down on all fours and it let out a scream, and it shook us to our core. We should have caught a visual 20 feet down the skidder trail, but clearly it had serious stealth going for it. The high-pitched sound was hitting our eardrums again as we sat there for another hour, concerned that we had not seen it leave the area. We knew it was still close, and being ambushed was on both of our minds. The stalemate drug on until my buddy finally said that he was going to walk down to the skidder trail and have a look. Well, I was terrified, and I was about to see my friend get torn up right in front of me. It only took him a minute or two before he shouted to me to help him estimate how tall this thing was by raising one end of his gun up in the air. His arm sockets were straining as he held the weapon above his head. We guessed the beast appeared to be at least 10 feet tall, judging by my buddy's sore rotator cuffs. I've heard stories over the years about Sasquatch and always blew them off as folklore. Whatever this thing was, it had somehow eluded us and vacated the premises. I was shook by my experience, and I chose to leave. On the ride home, my buddy told me about several encounters he'd had with Sasquatch over the years, and based on his well-worn travel tales, I assumed that they must be everywhere. When he invited me out into the wilderness for another overnighter, I declined. I couldn't bring myself to get back out there. He tried to convince me that sightings are few and far between and that the Sasquatch would rather be left alone. It's why he warned me off from shooting my gun at it that day. After letting the encounter simmer in my head for a few weeks, I let my buddy talk me into another hunting trip. He thought facing my fears by going out to the same general area would be good for me psychologically. I was nervous as hell while we were there, but after bagging 2 really nice muleys and an immature bull, I started feeling like my old self. It's always mystified me how the thing I saw that day managed to vanish without us viewing its escape. Some think they travel through portals, or that the high-pitched ringing we heard was something to do with their ability to teleport. I don't know if I believe that. It doesn't make me feel any better knowing that these things can appear wherever and whenever they want. I don't want to stop going out into the bush, so I'll continue on as I've always done. After 35 years of living in metropolitan Portland, Oregon, I moved in late 2006 to a tiny incorporated town of Springdale, Washington. The population there is 294. It's about an hour northwest of Spokane. I began a job doing community development planning and grant writing for the Northwestern Indian tribes. In the early summer of 2007, I was driving home from work. I had just left the Spokane Indian Reservation, heading north on a country road that is the eastern boundary of the reservation. Along the east side of that road is a steep embankment, and looking down, I spotted a small Sasquatch. It was maybe 4 feet tall. It had scraggly and dusty-looking charcoal hair that was about 4 inches long. It had wide shoulders like a human and no visible tail or ears. I couldn't determine if it was a male or a female. I saw it only in profile as it stepped forward, nearly on all fours. I never got a glimpse of its face. When I asked my coworkers the next day about Sasquatch sightings, I was told that they were not uncommon but were more often seen in the western side of the reservation, that bordered there by the Columbia River. The Ute Indian grandmother, with whom I became friends in Springdale, shared with me that she and her grandson, who attended elementary school, had seen a Sasquatch a couple of years earlier as they entered the town from the east. It crossed the road in front of their car in an area dotted with a few houses in the woods. Now, they claimed it was carrying a full green trash bag over its shoulder, as if it had just raided a garbage can. Well, while in Springdale, I began following Sasquatch reports and discussions on YouTube. I particularly enjoyed hearing Kumbo's encounters and information sharing, David Pilata's Sasquatch and Missing 411 stories, and Wes Germer's Sasquatch Chronicles. I realized I had a loose connection after hearing Germer's own riveting encounter near Yacolt, Washington. So as a planner, I used to drive there to help the town develop public works grant applications. In 2016, I moved back to the west side of the Cascade Mountains, this time in the backwoods of Washington, west of Mount St. Helens, a place rich with recorded reports of Sasquatch sightings. My highway area is partially forested but with open fields and scattered homes, and I have always thought it likely that there were Sasquatch frequenting this area. Well, one night, in the wee hours, I was sitting in my living room watching a free YouTube movie. I was suddenly startled by an awful crashing sound that shook my house. I could hear metal being bent and twisted, and I thought something was happening with the vent to my kitchen range. There was a noise so loud that it caused me to envision my kitchen cabinets falling off the wall. I checked around my house and I found nothing but a mirror that had come loose, and it had not broken. I decided that multiple tree limbs must have landed on my roof, and I planned to check the damage the next morning. I'm 74 years old and my vision is poor, so I phoned a neighbor and she came over to check the roof with me, but she saw no fallen limbs. But what I did find was that the decorative little wash basin I keep filled with large seashells had 5 of them removed and arranged in a perfect semicircle. I asked the neighbor if anyone had reported strange goings-on recently. Apparently, an elderly woman to the east of my house was awakened the night before by something repeatedly hitting the back wall of her house. I decided that I would camp out in my utility room with the back door propped open and see if my unruly visitor returned. Well, that night it was cold and uncomfortable and scary, so I gave up after about an hour. A few mornings later, however, shells were being removed from the tub and arranged in a semicircle again. The shells became a running theme, ending up in various places around my home, arranged in the same similar pattern. I wondered if my Sasquatch friend had a flair for decorating. Perhaps it was meant as something sinister, a calling card for future violence. The fall rains have arrived and it's been quiet. I really do not want to be face to face with a Sasquatch. U.S. indigenous tribes believe there's strong evidence that shows the cryptid to be a human hybrid and not an animal, and as such, I will likely be looking over my shoulder as I garden in the spring.